A single move condemned him. It wasn't murder or treason, but an act of pure arrogance that landed him on a list from which no one escaped. This is the story of how challenging Bumpy Johnson's authority was less a risk and more a sentence. In the fall of 1947, as the leaves in Central Park changed color, a new kind of business began to flourish on the fringes of Bumpy Johnson's kingdom. Joe the Gentleman Gallo, a capo in the Colombo family, decided, on his own initiative, that the rules of Harlem didn't apply to him. Gallo, known for his veneer of sophistication that barely concealed a predatory brutality, opened a new illegal gambling operation on 116th Street, right on the border of Bumpy's territory. He didn't ask permission. He didn't offer a percentage. It was an act of colonization, a mob flag planted with the arrogance of a conqueror. Gallo believed that Bumpy, busy consolidating his post-war power, wouldn't dare challenge a powerful family over a single betting point. He saw it as a clever business move, testing the waters. What he didn't understand was that, for Bumpy Johnson, his territory wasn't just geographical, it was an extension of his own sovereignty. That arrogant move didn't just irritate Bumpy, it activated him. Joe Gallo hadn't just opened a business. He'd signed up at the top of the list for a very expensive education on power in Harlem. Harlem in the late 1940s was a nation within a nation, struggling to define itself in the wake of World War II. Black soldiers returned from combat in Europe, where they fought for freedom, only to find the same old segregation and lack of opportunity back home. This tension created an atmosphere of frustration and ambition. The underground economy, ruled by Bumpy Johnson, was more than just crime. It was the largest employer of black men in Harlem. It offered a ladder of social mobility, however dangerous, that the white world denied. Bumpy's control over the numbers game, loan sharking, and other rackets wasn't just about profit. It was about power. The power to provide jobs, to settle disputes, to fund legitimate businesses, and even to support churches and civil rights activists. He was the shadow government of Harlem. The intrusion of a mobster like Joe Gallo was therefore not seen as competition. It was seen as a foreign incursion, a threat to the fragile economy and social order that Bumpy had built and on which the community, for better or worse, depended. Bumpy Johnson's psychological persona was that of a monarch jealous of his domain. He had spent years bleeding in a brutal war against Dutch Schultz to liberate Harlem from outside control. He had no intention of allowing new settlers to establish themselves piece by piece. His intelligence was not only strategic, but also political. He knew that allowing Gallo's incursion to go unanswered would be a sign of weakness. Other mobsters would see it as an invitation to open their own shops, eroding his power base and his revenue slice by slice. Bumpy was not a man of impulsive reactions. His mind worked like that of a grandmaster chess player. He didn't look at Gallo's move in isolation. He saw the 10 future moves that could result from it. The loss of a betting point was insignificant. The loss of authority, however, was catastrophic. Bumpy's reputation was that of a reasonable man, but inflexible when it came to his fundamental principles. And the most fundamental principle was, Harlem was his. Bumpy's moral code, though distorted by conventional standards, was absolute when it came to sovereignty. He had established an uneasy peace with the 5 families, a partnership based on mutual respect and clear boundaries. Bumpy paid tribute to the Mafia Commission in exchange for his autonomy in Harlem. Joe Gallo's act violated this agreement. It was an act of a subordinate acting without the sanction of his superiors, a breach of Mafia protocol as much as an invasion of Bumpy's territory. This gave Bumpy a strategic opening. He didn't need to declare war on the entire Colombo family. He only needed to isolate and remove Gallo, framing him as a rogue element threatening overall stability. Bumpy's code demanded a response, but his strategy dictated that the response should be surgical, designed to cause maximum impact with minimal collateral damage to the delicate peace between the crime syndicates. He wasn't just going to punish Gallo. He was going to use Gallo to send a message to everyone else. Bumpy's strategy began not with violence but with information. He activated his vast network of informants on the streets to learn everything about Joe Gallo's operation. Who were his runners? Who were his clients? Where did he keep his money? At the same time, he used his diplomatic contacts to send discreet messages to the heads of the Colombo family, expressing his disappointment with his capo's lack of respect. He was building a case, both on the streets and in the highest echelons of the underworld. He wasn't preparing for a battle, he was preparing for a trial. He wanted Gallo's removal to be seen not as an act of aggression on his part, but as the inevitable and justified consequence of Gallo's own arrogance. Bumpy was patiently putting all the pieces in place, ensuring that when he delivered the checkmate, no one could question the legitimacy of his move. His calm was the calm before the storm, a quietude that his enemies often mistook for inaction, to their own detriment. Bumpy's reputation as a protector of Harlem was fundamental to his power. He wasn't loved by everyone, but he was respected because he kept the worst predators out. The open presence of a mob operation on 116th Street was a direct insult to that reputation. It seemed he could no longer protect his own borders. Bumpy knew he needed to act decisively to reaffirm his role. Gallo's mistake was not understanding this dynamic. Coming from the outside, he saw Harlem only as a marketplace, a collection of streets and people to be exploited. He didn't see the complex web of loyalties, obligations, and history that held the place together under Bumpy's rule. He underestimated the almost mystical connection between Bumpy and his territory. Challenging Bumpy in his own backyard wasn't a business move, it was an act of sacrilege, and the retribution would be equally biblical in its finality. Joe Gallo thought he was playing checkers. Bumpy Johnson was playing for the throne. Joe the Gentleman. Gallo's fatal mistake was an act of territorial arrogance. Believing Bumpy Johnson wouldn't dare start a war with the powerful Colombo family, he not only opened his gambling operation, but did so ostentatiously. He placed his own men, white and visible, on street corners to take bets, a clear sign of disdain for local authority. The final straw, the arrogant move that put him at the top of Bumpy's list, was when he personally visited one of Bumpy's favorite restaurants in Harlem and, in a gesture of pure dominance, tried to pay Bumpy's bill. It was a symbolic gesture designed to humiliate Bumpy in his own sanctuary, to show everyone present that a new power had arrived. Bumpy, with icy calm, refused the offer, saying simply, "I always pay my own bills at home." At that moment, the Cold War turned hot. Gallo had underestimated the man, mistaking his restraint for weakness and his diplomacy for fear. The trap wasn't a direct confrontation, but a campaign of 1,000 cuts. Bumpy decided he wasn't just going to remove Gallo, he was going to dismantle his operation piece by piece, humiliating and ruining him before the final blow. First, Gallo's clients began to be mugged on their way to place their bets. Then Gallo's runners were beaten and their betting books burned. The police, receiving anonymous tips from Bumpy's sources, began raiding Gallo's place almost daily, confiscating money and arresting employees. Gallo's operation became a financial black hole. He was losing money, respect, and control of the situation. Desperate, Gallo agreed to meet with Bumpy for a truce. The chosen location was an abandoned warehouse near the train tracks on Manhattan's West Side, a supposedly neutral place. The atmosphere was dark and cavernous, the sound of passing trains creating an oppressive rhythm. The tension was palpable. Gallo entered the warehouse expecting a deal, but the size of the space and the dancing shadows made him feel small and exposed. The confrontation was a masterclass in psychological warfare. When Gallo arrived with his men, he found Bumpy waiting, not with an army, but with only 2 of his most trusted lieutenants. However, scattered throughout the vast warehouse, on the walkways and in the shadows, Gallo could feel, more than see, the presence of dozens of other men. Bumpy had transformed the space into an amphitheater of intimidation. The conversation began with Bumpy calmly detailing, with impressive precision, every dollar Gallo had lost in recent weeks. He exposed Gallo's entire operation, his weaknesses, his contacts, proving that he knew everything. Gallo's arrogance turned to cold dread. He realized he wasn't in a negotiation, he was in an autopsy of his own failure. The irreversibility of the situation hit him when Bumpy said, "You wanted a piece of Harlem, Joe, but you didn't understand that Harlem isn't a cake to be sliced. It's my home, and I don't welcome uninvited guests." Underestimation was the cancer that killed Gallo's ambition. He assumed Bumpy was a local problem, while he was part of a national organization. He didn't understand that Bumpy, through his strategic alliance with Lucky Luciano, had friends in even higher places than him. Bumpy had obtained the tacit sanction of the Mafia Commission to deal with the Gallo problem, who was seen as a cowboy threatening stability. Gallo thought he was playing a regional game. Bumpy was operating on a national level. The trap in the warehouse wasn't just physical, but also political. By exposing Gallo's incompetence and dismantling his operation so efficiently, Bumpy proved to Gallo's superiors that he wasn't a viable business partner. He wasn't just destroying Gallo, he was destroying his reputation, which in the mafia world was more valuable than life. Gallo's mistake was not understanding the nature of Bumpy's power. He saw territory as something to be conquered by force, but Bumpy saw it as something to be governed by respect, information, and extremely precise violence. Bumpy's harassment campaign was designed to avoid open warfare. It was a shadow war, an urban guerrilla campaign that his mafia opponents, accustomed to direct confrontations, didn't know how to combat. The warehouse was the final act of this campaign. The bare walls and empty space reflected Gallo's situation. He was exposed, isolated, and without options. The tension in the room was the sound of a man's career and life coming to an end. Bumpy, with his calm and control, was the master of ceremonies at Gallo's funeral, a funeral that was taking place while the condemned man was still breathing. The turning point came when Joe Gallo, humiliated and defeated, finally offered Bumpy everything he wanted: shut down the operation, pay a tribute, anything to get out of that room alive. It was in that moment of pleading that Bumpy Johnson took complete and utter control. He didn't accept the offer. Instead, he stood up, walked over to Gallo and placed a hand on his shoulder, an almost paternal gesture. "The problem, Joe," Bumpy said softly, "isn't your business. It's your arrogance. It's the fact that you thought you could just come in here and take what's mine." Then Bumpy turned to one of his lieutenants and said a single word: "Clean up." Gallo understood. There was no negotiation. There was no second chance. His submission didn't matter. The verdict had already been delivered the day he opened his shop on 116th Street. Arrogance was a disease, and Bumpy was the cure. The direct consequence of Gallo's mistake was his transfer. Bumpy, in a stroke of strategic genius, didn't kill him. Gallo's death could have created a martyr and forced the Colombo family into a war to save face. Instead, Bumpy used his influence to have Gallo demoted and transferred out of New York to an insignificant position in another city. The consequence was utter humiliation. Joe the gentleman, the man who wanted to be a king, was exiled as an outcast. The symbolic consequence was the dismantling of his operation. The day after the meeting at the warehouse, Bumpy's men took over Gallo's gambling den, repainted the facade, and reopened it as a subsidiary of Bumpy's empire. It was a silent and complete power grab, a signal to all that Bumpy's sovereignty was absolute. The message that cemented Bumpy's untouchability was the list itself. After the incident with Gallo, the legend of Bumpy's list began to circulate. It was said that Bumpy kept a mental list of everyone who had disrespected him, big or small, and sooner or later he would cross each name off the list, not necessarily with death, but with a punishment perfectly tailored to destroy what that person valued most: their power, their reputation, their wealth. Gallo's punishment, exile and humiliation instead of death, was perhaps the most terrifying of all. It showed that Bumpy was not just a killer. He was a strategist who could destroy a man in 1,000 different ways. The symbol of Bumpy's power was not a weapon, but his mind, his patience, and his invisible list. The fear was not of dying, but of one day waking up and discovering that your name had been added to it. The historical impact of that event was not merely significant, it was transformative in the architecture of underworld power. From that moment forward, a new precedent was firmly established. Any mafia business conducted in Harlem required the approval and mediation of Bumpy Johnson. He ceased to be viewed as a strong local figure operating on borrowed time and instead emerged as an institutional authority. Bumpy became the gatekeeper, the sole conduit through which external families could operate within Harlem's borders. This shift altered the balance of power across New York's criminal landscape. Other mafia families no longer perceived him as a rival to be undermined or eliminated, but as a sovereign force whose position demanded recognition. In practical terms, this elevated his prestige and dramatically increased his revenue streams. Every transaction validated his authority. Every negotiation reinforced his legitimacy. Harlem was no longer contested territory, it was a jurisdiction. By forcing the mafia to acknowledge him as an equal rather than a target, Bumpy transformed informal dominance into recognized sovereignty, solidifying control through structure rather than constant confrontation. What made this consolidation of power even more remarkable was that it was achieved without open warfare. The defeat of Joe Gallo occurred quietly, methodically, and without the spectacle of bloodshed that usually accompanied shifts in criminal dominance. This outcome was widely regarded within the underworld as a masterclass in strategy. Bumpy Johnson demonstrated that true power did not require public violence to validate itself. He dismantled Gallo's ambitions through isolation, political maneuvering, and pressure applied at precisely the right points. In doing so, he proved that he could defeat the mafia at its own game: power, influence, and negotiation, not merely in street-level conflict. This elevated his reputation to a level few had ever reached. He was no longer measured solely by his control of Harlem, but by his ability to impose outcomes on mafia families without firing a shot. The absence of war was itself the victory. It sent a clear signal that resistance was futile not because of brute force, but because Bumpy controlled the structure within which force could even be applied. The story of Joe Gallo's downfall soon evolved into a parable whispered throughout the underworld. It was no longer told simply as a tale of defeat, but as a lesson about the limits of raw power. Gallo possessed strength, ambition, and backing, yet he lacked the most critical asset of all: wisdom. He acted decisively but blindly, without understanding the complexity of the board he was attempting to dominate. He saw territory where Bumpy saw systems. He saw confrontation where Bumpy saw leverage. This fundamental difference defined the outcome long before it became visible. Bumpy Johnson understood every piece on the board, every square of influence, and every possible chain reaction. He anticipated moves, not because he was reactive, but because he was patient. Gallo's failure was not a lack of courage, it was a failure of perspective. He mistook noise for strength and visibility for authority. In contrast, Bumpy operated quietly, allowing others to underestimate him until they were already trapped by their own assumptions. At its core, the confrontation between Bumpy Johnson and Joe Gallo was not about territory or profit, but about competing philosophies of power. Gallo represented arrogant, ostentatious dominance, power that needed to be seen, felt, and feared immediately. Bumpy embodied a different doctrine entirely: quiet, strategic, and absolute power. His authority did not announce itself, it asserted itself through outcomes. This distinction reshaped how the underworld evaluated leadership. The lesson was unmistakable. Power that relies on intimidation alone invites challenge. Power rooted in structure, alliances, and inevitability discourages it. By the time Gallo realized the nature of the contest he was engaged in, the result was already decided. He was playing checkers on a chessboard he did not understand. The underworld absorbed this lesson quickly. Challenging Bumpy Johnson in Harlem was no longer viewed as bold or ambitious. It was seen as reckless. Sovereignty, once established through strategy rather than violence, became nearly impossible to dislodge. The legacy of that confrontation endured far beyond the individuals involved. It taught the underworld a lesson that would be repeated for generations. Challenging Bumpy Johnson's sovereignty in his own kingdom was the fastest path to ruin. Humiliation, exile, and loss of influence were only the mildest consequences. Those who understood history knew there were fates far worse than public defeat. Bumpy's true power lay in his ability to decide outcomes quietly, without spectacle and without appeal. He did not need to destroy everyone who opposed him. He needed only to demonstrate that opposition was futile. This restraint amplified his authority rather than diminishing it. By mastering the politics of power instead of merely its violence, Bumpy Johnson secured a position that transcended the typical lifespan of criminal dominance. His story is not remembered because of chaos or bloodshed, but because of control. And in the underworld, control, not force, is the rarest and most enduring form of power.